Hello, and welcome to the first episode of There Are No Bad Ports, Just Bad Players. I am your host, a Jaded Gamer, and I will be playing through the 2012 Steam version of Dark Souls, using my completely original gimmick of recording my hands while playing the game with the unmodded, as intended by developers, version of that game. With no further ado, let's begin. Welcome to the first episode of There Are No Bad Ports, Just Bad Players. This is the 2012 version of Dark Souls released on Steam. At the time it was well known for being a terrible port, though at the time this was mostly overlooked by the community due to the game's popularity exploding. Those that did notice, however, downloaded a mod to fix the frame rate, resolution, and the controls to make it more playable on a PC, mouse and keyboard. The purpose of this video is to prove that it is playable, while calling attention to the failings of the developers. Well, let's begin then. In the options menu, like every PC Master Race player should. As mainstream and comfortable as WASD is to use for movement, I find that it's ultimately more limiting and you end up using only a quarter of the keyboard. My preferred method is to use a TFGH. I find it far more comfortable and find that it gives me a reach of 3/4 of the keyboard with one hand. I chose to use my right hand to control the camera, as usually it would be on the mouse, but the mouse is absolutely unusable in this game, as you'll see shortly. The arrow keys are simple enough to reach for swapping weapons and items. As for the attack and defense buttons, I found that placing them on the numpad is also much easier, while leaving utility buttons such as interact and consume item is much easier to do with the left hand. For some reason you're not able to reuse the movement controls for the selection buttons. I have no idea why, other than bad programming. Fortunately, D and X were available for confirm and cancel, which is great for my pinky finger, and that just about does it for the controls. To move on. The name Doagatra is my alias and has been for near on a decade now. It seems only right to use it. As for character creator in this game, I don't really have much to say about it. I always go off the same thing, it's just years of habit, though I do like to give myself a bit more of a challenge by picking the weakest weapon and armor from the outset. Alright, time to test out the controls on this thing. Movement seems to work correctly. The camera seems to work as intended, and the inversion seems correct. And the utility buttons also function. Time to test out the combat buttons. They seem functional, if a little awkward. Before we continue, I'll just display how the controls function. The mouse is simply unusable. You can't even move it left or right without it jittering up and down the whole time. And when in the menu, the camera still moves as you move the mouse, and the only buttons on the mouse that work are left, right and middle. You can't use any additional buttons. It is simply unreasonable for them to expect a player to play the game in that manner. In just this brief time showing you this, I've already started to develop a headache because of the way the camera jitters. I've always found it neat that you can see the demon waiting above. I've never understood why they put a bonfire there. It seems completely useless, though perhaps it's foreshadowing for Dark Souls 3. The camera controls are pretty touchy, and the movement controls, because they're individual for the direction of the character, make it move very janky. I've never liked that rolling ball trap. It doesn't seem to fit. I just don't see how that little weak monster can push it.
You and I, regrettably, will not. I would hate.
As for the Dying Knight, I've never really cared. He just seems like a means to an end. Basically just something to hand out a potion and a key, in my opinion. I don't see why him giving you the potion is any different to other undead that have potions. And why can't I take their potions when I defeat them? What a wonderful camera angle that was. I've always felt that the fight with the demon is very anticlimactic. I just don't see why such a large creature is defeated by a piece of wood. It just seems so dumb. I've never understood why they used a crow to take you away from the asylum. It's never explained in the slightest to my knowledge. And as far as I know, it never shows up in any other games either. Although the Firelink Shrine works well as a hub, and there are a couple of pickups around, don't really think much of it beyond its general use. I've never been a fan of using the covenants in the game. They're always just too vague. And as far as I'm concerned, if the game doesn't explain them, why should I bother with them? I do like how it ends up connecting to many different areas, and the little hidden area that leads to the graveyard underneath the lift was a good find. I don't find the small skeletons to be all that interesting, but larger ones are quite intimidating and have a nice range to their attacks. From what I've gathered, a lot of people have had difficulty with this part of the game. I don't really understand it. It's got to get out of the way, like with everything in the game. Mistakes happen, but for the most part, just move. The reason that I come to the graveyard is to get the Zweihander sword. I've always tended to just pick a weapon and go with it, and this one really works for me. There isn't much else that we can do at the graveyard right now, so let's continue. Never bothered really using the smith in this area. I like how the hollows here don't really bother you unless you bother them first. This is a nice little touch. I worked out that if you go ahead and just run past the ghosts, you can grab a Firekeeper soul right off the bat. And all you need to do is either die or use a Homeward Bone. Nice and easy for a +1 flask. By using what souls I've collected so far and a couple of consumables, I'm already capable of using the 24 strength Zweihander, albeit in a two-handed fashion for now. I've always preferred to use weapons two-handed in this game. There's only a few circumstances where I find that using a shield is necessary or advantageous. I've always liked this part to Undead Burg. It sort of feels like you're assaulting a little garrison on the way through, and it's a good test for new and old players alike, I think. At this point, the controls were really starting to test me. The camera was the bigger issue of the lot. I decided to test out if the kick would work on a keyboard, and quite frankly it barely works, and often when you want it to, it doesn't, as the first attempt shows. It would probably be a better idea not to bother with it and just strike them with the weapon. But as far as I'm concerned, if the devs include something in the game, it should be used, particularly if it's a main function in the controls. I've always felt it's worth kindling this fire, as it's in between two bosses. The Black Knights, although quite intimidating, are real pushovers once you realise you just have to be aggressive with them. After that, there's not much I can do about it. I've got pretty mixed feelings about this boss. When you first see it, it's really intimidating and challenging, and you just don't know what to expect, being the first main boss of the game, excluding the Silent Demon, which is more of a pushover than anything. Once you realise it's really just an enemy from the second part of the game, it really diminishes any replay value it has. The only really interesting part to this fight is the archers in the tower. If you don't know they're there, they're an issue, but once you do, you're never going to leave them. I really dislike the way the dragon is introduced here. Even though there are scorch marks on the bridge, there's been clutter like that everywhere in the game so far. But taking the logical leap that a player is going to guess that a dragon will approach from behind and burn them to death is just a step too far in my opinion. I always used to take the underpath to get past the dragon, but once I worked out you just have to hide to the side and then run under it. It's really a non-option at that point. The only downside is if it decides to leap and breathe fire, you're screwed no matter what you do. Here's a fun fact I worked out. If you just sprint past these enemies and go straight onto the gate, you can beat the guy who locks it. It seems like a good skip to me. Much like the Black Knights, this guy's a real pushover. You just gotta smack him a few times and he just keeps backing up trying to heal. But at least you get a Firekeeper soul out of it. Once again, this is a great bonfire to kindle as it's in between two areas that are quite difficult. I also upgraded my weapon here so I could take out the gargoyles with little issue. These boulder knights with the small shield used to be a bit of an issue for me, however, once I realised you can just smash them down with a heavy weapon, it's not really a problem. I quite like the way they included a strong enemy with weak enemies here. It makes for a good dynamic, and the fact that the stronger one can buff the weaker only adds to the challenge. I've never understood why the community at large doesn't like summoning NPCs or assistants for bosses. I find it just adds to the fun of the fight, makes it a bit more dynamic. One thing I quite dislike about this game is being invaded. All it does is waste my time as I have no interest in participating in it. Quite frankly, I don't like my single player experience being ruined by some asshole. I've always thought this fight was quite good. Nice and challenging, perhaps a little too much so with the clunky controls. I'm not talking just because of the keyboard ones. The game's pretty clunky in general. The fact that one will stay close and one will stay far and breathe fire at you is a real nice touch to the fight. With the first bell rung, it's time to return to Filing Shrine and then the Undead Asylum to claim our ring.
Leave me no choice. I was once grateful to you. But if this is our fate, so be it.
I've always quite liked how this area was hidden above. The fact that you need to get the key and then work out that you have to rest in the bird's nest for quite a while, I think works really well as a hidden area, even though that hidden area is really just a place you're returning to. On the downside, however, it is extremely cryptic. Most people will miss this. Fortunately though, there's nothing there that's essential for victory, just a bonus if anything, much like a hidden area should contain. Much like my previous comments, I don't really care for this character. It's just a means to an end, and quite frankly, now it's just a shield drop. So, moving on. Although there's a few extra Dark Knights and a somewhat hidden sudden boss, I won't be doing those in this run, as they offer me nothing I need. I only came here to collect the water walking ring, even though I'll only be using it a few times. And with that, 1/8 of the game is complete. It's time to start heading downwards. I decided to take a detour through the Darkroot Garden to collect some armor and a shield that would help me greatly. I quite like how they've hidden a bonfire in this spot. Works really well and is a great hidden checkpoint for later on. quite like these enemies. They've got a nice deliberate slowness to their animations. I used to try and grind for their armor when I first started playing, but of course that's just in a box later on, which I thought was a bit disappointing. At least you can still get their sword and shield to drop if you're persistent enough. Black Knight here has the polearm that I used to use as my main weapon until I found the Zweihander was far more effective. It's still worth coming here, if only for the Grass Crest shield with the stamina buff. Having returned to the Undead Burg, I took advantage of the woodstone bonfire and continued on to the next boss. Although the Capra Demon on its own is very intimidating, what tips this fight over to panic is the two dogs that are added to the fight. If they weren't there, I don't think this would be even remotely challenging, as proven later as these opponents are simply pushovers in the second half of the game. Though in saying that, the fight still challenges you at the time you reach it. The arena that you fight the Capra Demon in is quite well designed, I feel, considering its small size and little room to move in. It only adds to the effect of the what the fuck as you enter it. I decided to skip ahead through the depths because as interesting as green and brown is, I don't really have much to say about it. As for the Gaping Dragon, I feel that the fight itself is interesting in the design of the creature, and the arena you fight it in is acceptably large. However, the fight itself is quite dull. Aside from severing the tail, there isn't much else to the fight other than running away and waiting for your opportunity. I've always quite liked the transition between the depths and Blighttown. It's got a real dread to it. This is one of the other bonfires I always kindle, just because I can't be bothered doing the next boss fight properly. I'd rather just take a few extra hits and get it done with, otherwise it just drags out. Much like the depths, there isn't much to say about Blighttown. It's just a generally crappy area, not just because of the environment, but frame rate on consoles is just frankly embarrassing, and it should have never been released in that state. Fortunately though, on PC it's dependent on your rig and not some garbage console. I've always quite liked this boss, if only because it's a chimera type creature, several different parts all acting independently. I feel like this boss fight always drags on, regardless of how powerful your weapon may be. But at least it keeps you interested by having you move around and avoid danger zones, something a lot of MMO players still don't seem able to do. And with that, another bell is rung, and 2/8 of the game has been completed. I decided to get a parasite, just cause. Wish I had more of a reason, just bored at this point, I guess. I've always quite disliked this lift. It just feels like it's going to kill you no matter what you do. Though I don't believe I've ever actually died because of it, funnily enough. The toxic spitters in the zone have always been an issue, but the spot right here near the Firekeeper's Soul is just ridiculous. Especially since some of them are far across the side and you cannot reach them without any range. I just ended up chasing it and going through quickly. I decided to grab the long sword over here for use later on in the catacombs. I'll display that for later. I've never really felt like Sans Fortress fits in well with the rest of the game. It just sort of looks and feels like it sticks out like a sore thumb. I do, however, appreciate that the devs tried something different by incorporating traps and other unusual situations into the level to try and give it a bit of variety. But it's because of that that I don't really enjoy the level. You've probably noticed by this point that I haven't been rescuing any of the NPCs scattered throughout the world. The reason for this is that most of them revolve around using magics or offer benefits to certain covenants or whatever. That just doesn't work with my playstyle. I've always been an up-close and personal type of player. I find that it's more fun in this type of game at least. As you can see here, I tend not to save the souls of the bosses. I'd rather get the benefit out of them immediately than some obscure weapon I'll never end up making. Stats wise, I tend to just get the strength I need for the weapon and then go heavy on stamina and vitality after that. I find there's almost no point in over-leveling strength or dexterity once you have the stats that you need for your weapon, as smithing them is by far a more effective manner of powering them up and getting very small returns on expensive stat points. As for the Iron Golem boss, pretty uneventful, heavy deliberate swings, not much more to him, other than an extremely broken grab attack, which I've seen pull me across half the arena at times, just ridiculous. I've always wondered why they used gargoyles to transport you to Anor Londo. They've already used that in Demon Souls in a much more effective manner. I don't recall it happening in Dark Souls 2, but it definitely did in Dark Souls 3 at least 2 times. Devs must have had some sort of obsession with it, I guess. This is by far one of the worst and awkward jumps in the game. I always feel like I'm gonna fuck it up. This part was nearly impossible to do on a keyboard. The amount of jank you have to deal with the camera, and then the stiff controls just nearly broke me. Ended up dying about 10 times here. A couple of them because I was stupid enough to use the lock on. I guess that's my own fault. I decided to take a small detour and grab the armor in the cathedral below. I don't intend on doing the painted world, it's just a small contained level. Don't really care for the boss, normally just ignore it and drop down if I ever do go there. I had been dreading this part of the game with the horrible keyboard controls. Bad enough on console where it controls reasonably well, but somehow I just managed to fluke my way through it. That'll never happen twice, I'm sure. I've always felt this fight is very skill-based, but at the same time it's also a test of patience. I initially tried to use a sword and shield stance to get through it. That just took ages and ages. Ornstein would almost always just dodge out of the way of my slow swings, so I ended up two-handing the weapon and was trying to beat him down quickly and then handle smoke, which ended up working a lot better. But even so, it was about 10 to 15 deaths before I got it. Playing this fight again, I noticed just how broken it is. A lot of the attacks from Ornstein clip through everything and he zips around like a fucking Power Ranger, when some of his attacks don't go through properly. Pretty ridiculous. Having received the Lord's vessel, I went and placed it immediately and completed half the game. Time to go finish off the 4 Lords now. I decided to go after Seif because it's the one I enjoy least before. I think that's saying something considering how shit the game gets after the Lord's Vessel part. Quite like the way they use narrow halls and a charging opponent to increase the difficulty here. Though for whatever reason I was unable to backstab the balls. Maybe it was an intentional design choice? I don't know. Probably just broken gameplay. As much as I dislike this room, it is quite well designed with enemy placements. But what sets it apart from other areas is the mix of weak and strong enemies, much like the lead up to the Gargoyles fight. It works quite well. I quite like the lead up to Seif's room. Got a nice build up with the crystal becoming more common as you approach, and the phantom adds to it. As for the fight itself, it's a fucking joke. There's absolutely nothing you can do, and I can't believe they included something like this in the game that has been so consistent up to this point. It's just an absolute joke. I've always disliked this room. The organ machine up top playing the sounds gives me an absolute headache. The opponents in this room just feel shoehorned in, and I don't know what's up with the Medusa type creatures. They just seem completely out of place. Like someone built the model and said, use it. So they did. I've always thought that the run to Seath from the closest graveyard is just way too far. Maybe it's because of the risk with running over the invisible platforms. I can't say for sure, but it just feels like it's a step too far in my opinion. I quite like the atmosphere in the Crystal Cave. It's nice and calm. I've always been a fan of the colour blue as well. It juxtaposes quite well with the upcoming fight. I remember when I first got to this spot, I just stopped and looked. Couldn't work out what was supposed to be there. It was because I stopped and looked that I realised that the flakes were hitting something that couldn't be seen. I think it's a really good example of something you can only do in a computer game. I'm not sure how to feel about this fight, the way it starts with the regeneration crystal in the back. Just comes across as a cruel trick more than anything. I am glad that they used a very deadly effect in this fight. Cursed crystals really make you focus and worry about the outcome of the fight. I am glad that they kept this sort of thing to only the Lord fights though. If they were in regular fights, they'd just become mundane otherwise. I do wish they did more with Seath though. It all he does is flail around and breathe crystals at you. Once you've gotten that down, there's not much else to the fight. And with the First Lord dead, we're 5/8 of the way through the game. Earlier I picked up Astora's longsword on the cliffside by the dying drake outside Blighttown. My reasons for doing so were to use it in the catacombs. Because the sword has faith damage attached to it, it will destroy the skeletons without them being able to be revived by the necromancers in the catacombs. It greatly simplifies all the encounters you have here. The sword itself has very low base stat requirements and makes for a great starting weapon if you take the Master Key gift, assuming of course you prefer single-hand weapons. It took me a while, but I ended up working out this shortcut to get down to Pinwheel. Unfortunately, Pinwheel starts a bad habit for some of the later game bosses by having you fall into the arena and take unavoidable damage. Other than that, this boss is completely unremarkable. Just hit him a few times and he falls over dead. Bit of a joke. For whatever reason, the necromancers in the previous area did not drop the lantern, so I was forced to navigate my way through the Tomb of the Giants by feel more than anything else. I can't think why the lantern didn't drop. I'm pretty sure I killed every necromancer, so it's just bad luck, I guess. I've always quite liked this area. I find it really challenging, and the lack of lighting, even with the lantern, is exceptionally well done. I always feel like there's something I miss here because of that. That only adds to my enjoyment of the area, I think. Initially I found it quite difficult to navigate this dark maze, and I found if you just stuck to the walls it really wasn't that difficult once the enemies were cleared out, though this skeleton ogre and the Black Knight combination almost finished me off. Very lucky. Once again, this boss has unavoidable fall damage at the start, followed up by an unseen attack from underneath, which is usually enough to kill the player outright. I just don't see how something like that gets through testing, especially when there's been only one other case of it so far in the game. I realise I wanted to sell the game on its difficulty, but there's difficulty and there's just plain unfair. Unavoidable damage aside, I do quite like this fight. It's got enough going on to keep it constantly interesting and your mind active throughout. Though if you do not have a strong weapon at this point in the game, the ads will easily overwhelm you. But then again, if you got this far, you should have a strong weapon. There's no real excuses. And just like that, another one bites the dust, and we're 6/8 of the game done now. Let's move on. When I think boring, I think ceaseless discharge. It is one of the most basic wait, move, attack bosses in the game. Apparently there's a way to make this boss fall off the ledge it's standing on. Quite frankly, if you need to cheat to beat this boss, you need to get good, as the mature fanbase says. boring boss aside, this very area is one of my most disliked in the game. Not because of the extreme linearity to it, it's not because of the dull enemies, it's because the colour palette and brightness of the lighting gives me a massive headache every time I come here. I'm not sure if it was my general lack of attention or massive headache I had, or perhaps just the crappy controls and the fact that I'd almost stopped using the camera whenever I could. But for whatever reason, I fell straight down a pitfall here and almost wet myself laughing. It was one of the funniest moments I had while recording. I've never fought much at this boss. All 3 times you can fight it in the game. The only difference between this one and the second one at the asylum is it's got a bit more red glow on it. It's just exceedingly disappointing and has an inflated health pool because, you know, that's how you make things hard, right? painfully drawn out fight this is. Thank the God I don't believe in it's over. When I think completely broken, pain in the ass boss centipede comes to mind. As if it isn't bad enough, this boss just flails around most of the time. The platform you're forced to fight it on is unacceptably small. The fog door constantly interrupts the view of the camera. The lighting makes it an absolute pain to look at, and you often just get pushed off by the centipede's hitbox into the lava and die instantly. As far as I'm concerned, this is by far the worst boss in the entire game. And yes, I'm putting it above the bed of chaos. Don't worry, we're getting to that shortly. as bad as this boss is, and it is, I don't feel it compares to the Centipede in terms of just outright things that are bad with it. Yes, the thing just flails randomly. Yes, it casts spells, but at least you can see what's going on. And for that reason alone, I do think it's better than the Centipede boss. And yes, this is a supercut version of the fight. It only took me about 5 or 6 goes to get it. I don't think it's worth showing the few times I died. They were uneventful and generally cheap. There's not much more to say about them. And with this boss down, we're 7/8 of the way through the game. Time for the Sunken City. Due to my inability to plan ahead, I didn't have enough souls to purchase the crest to open the door in the Darkroot Garden, so I decided to pay the Moonlight Butterfly a visit. I quite like this boss, it's got a nice atmosphere to it, it's just generally elegant. The only real downsides to it is how long it takes for it to drift down. Of course I could have a ranged weapon, but that's just not the way I like to play. Despite the community's like for this boss and Artorias in general, I don't. As surprising as that may or may not be. I don't like judging bosses by the vague amount of information they give you. I prefer to judge them by the fight itself. This fight is fucking janky. The wolf flails around all the time. Most of its attacks hit within a quarter of a second, which is just too fast for me to react. And it looks fucking ridiculous with a sword in its mouth. It's a fucking wolf, for Christ's sake. And if you disagree with that, good. It's what makes us human. To put it simply, if the boss didn't drop the ring necessary to get to the Four Kings, I wouldn't have even bothered including it in this video. As for the sunken city, I quite like it, although the colours are a bit drab. I think the ghosts fit really well in it, and they help pull together the feeling of a lost city, at least in a fantasy setting. I find cutting through the valley of the Drakes once the city is drained is much more efficient than running all the way from Firelink to Shrine. There may be a bonfire I don't know about, but based on the long boss runs I've seen in this half of the game, I doubt it. It took me quite a while to work out that I needed the ring here when I first played, though with the item descriptions and just piecing things together I was able to work it out. As for the four kings themselves, the fight either goes really well or really badly. They often spam their AoE close range attack and that'll knock out most of your HP and then smack you with their weapon before you get up properly. Although I did notice that if you get close enough they hit you with their hand and not the weapon. I don't know if they programmed it that way intentionally, but that's how it works. It's just one of those well designed fights. Unless you're a bit slow on the damage and 5 of them spawn, because, 4 means 5, right? And with that so-so Lord fight out of the way, on to the final part. You've no doubt noticed that during the run I have been just running past most enemies. The reason for this is most of them are just there to slow you down. They give you absolutely no souls, and unless you really want a piece of the equipment they have, I find this is no reason to kill them. I never really got how this area is underground, but at the same time there's a sky. It doesn't really make any sense. And the serpent takes you under the ground, right? It's clearly what it shows. And there's probably some bizarre lore reason that's never explained, which is why it's the way it is. Initially this boss was giving me a bit of a jus, but then I remembered I have a parry button, and making the last boss easily beaten by parrying was a great idea in games. noticed how the music in this fight sounds nearly identical to the song in Twilight Princess when Midna is hurt and you're returning to the castle? There's some bizarre coincidence, no doubt, and I can't help but think that. Sadly, that is the most interesting thing I have to say about this fight. I find it exceedingly dull, especially because you just parry the crap out of him. For a game series that boasts its difficulty and interesting boss challenges, this one really disappoints. Well, that was the first episode of There Are No Bad Ports, Just Bad Players. Next month I will be comparing Final Fantasy 12, 13 and 15 due to the general dislike of those games and my opinion why I believe most people are incorrect about them. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments. I am a Jaded Gamer. Thank you for watching.